is Anthony Lewis, way out at the left end, denouncing labor for its crude, brutal tactics and so on. It had very constructive proposals on it, which were in fact the same as the proposals of Congress's own research bureau, which also couldn't get into the meeting. Like total censorship, not organized, just total recognition by the owners of the media that you just do not say things like this. Okay, so a version of NAFTA got through, which was designed virtually to harm the interests of working people in all three countries, which is exactly what it's done. There's a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute that just came out about it. If you want details, and there have been some earlier ones. That was a gift to management and to investors. And one part, getting back to immigration, one part of NAFTA is that Mexico is required to accept a flood of highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness exports. And the subsidies are enormous. The agribusiness system is like an offshoot of the state. It couldn't function otherwise. So you get enormously subsidized agribusiness exports flooding into Mexico. What happens to Mexican campesinos? They can't compete. So they're going to be driven off the land. They're either going to be driven off the land or, go to the economics department, if you don't mind my insulting economist, and they'll explain to you that their comparative advantage is in producing, cherry tomatoes or something, not corn for tortillas in Mexico. So they should get that from the United States. They should be selling fruit to the United States or some story in economics departments that tells you that. But the reality is quite different. If, I forgot the exact number, I'm sorry, I don't have it in my head, but a large number of Mexican farmers were, of course, driven off the land. And they're driven into cities where Mexican businesses can't function because they got to compete with highly subsidized U.S. corporations that have to get national treatment in Mexico. So one of the parts of NAFTA is that General Motors gets national treatment in Mexico, but a Mexican of flesh and blood doesn't get national treatment in New York. It's sent to Guantanamo if he asks for it. These things have nothing to do with free trade or anything else. There's power plays, class war, and it was pretty clear from the beginning of NAFTA that it was going to lead to a flood of immigration. And yeah, it did, not just from Mexico, but from Central America, where the countries were devastated by Reagan's wars, barely survived. So you smash up countries, you prevent them from functioning. Yeah, oddly enough, you get people fleeing from big surprise. In fact, why is the flood of immigration from south to north and not from north to south? The same in Europe. How come people are fleeing from Africa to Europe and not from Europe to Africa? Well, a couple hundred years of history to explain that. Is there an alternative? Yeah, there's an alternative. In fact, a constructive alternative. So go back to NAFTA again. At the time when the Clinton version of NAFTA was rammed through without any discussion, no discussion permitted in the press, literally none. The Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, Congress's Research Bureau, which incidentally Congress has since gotten rid of. They don't want research. They just want the business propaganda, so that's gone. But at that time it existed. OTA, and the American labor movement came out with detailed proposals for a North American trade agreement, but a different one, which was modeled in part on the European Union integration system, which worked pretty well. I mean, in Europe, it's not identical here, different circumstances, but the same model. In Europe, before the poor countries, the southern countries, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, before they were admitted into the EU, there were preliminary measures taken to lessen the difference between living standards and wages of southern and northern workers. There was compensatory funding, it still goes on, in fact. That's part of the reason why Spain has a high growth rate. It's still getting compensatory funding. But it was kind of leveled. it leveled the system so you wouldn't get a flood of, barely surviving dirt poor immigrants undermining the wage system of Northern Europe. Well, it didn't work perfectly, but it partly worked, and it worked reasonably successfully. And something like that could have been adapted for Mexico before Mexico was brought in. Right? In that case, you wouldn't have the economic disaster in Mexico that you've had, and you wouldn't have people flooding to the north. In fact, it's now getting really serious with the ethanol craze. Ethanol is probably going to starve poor people all over the world. The current issue of foreign affairs, again, the main establishment journal, has an article by two University of Minnesota agricultural economists, and called something like "Will Ethanol Starve the Poor?" And they go into the reasoning as to why that's probably going to happen. I won't run through it, but the obvious thing is that as in the United States, the ethanol industry is just another example of the way the state sector runs the economy. It's not a free enterprise economy by any remote measure. Farmers in Iowa can produce ethanol because they get a huge government subsidy, and because of a very high tariff to keep out cheap Brazilian ethanol, which is much easier to produce. It's from sugar instead of corn, and also much more efficient. So since we can't win any competition, you set up high protectionist barriers. Meanwhile, economists talk about free trade and its wonders. But this industry is in fact shifting production to the kind of the variety of corn, particular variety of corn, which is usable for ethanol, but not for tortillas, not for cattle, not for other products. But what you see in the United States is prices going up in the supermarket and a whole range of products. Well, the United States is a rich country, so the price of beef and pork and peas and so on goes up. You can kind of live with it. In Mexico, people are on the border of starvation. They live on tortillas. When you can't, and in fact, the Mexican corn, white corn that's used for tortillas, is now disappearing because industrial users want to buy it because the yellow corn that's used for ethanol is going up too high. So they buy the corn that Mexicans use for tortillas. So you get, in fact, a couple of months ago, there was Mexico City was blowing up with riots because people could not buy tortillas. Well, okay, that's a lot of them will flee to the north. So yes, there are definite processes going on which have consequences, and they don't have to go on. Not at all. Plenty of alternatives make a lot more sense. But as long as that's social and economic policy, you're going to get immigration pouring. Those are the primary issues that should be discussed before anyone even turns to the question of immigration. Then there's a whole lot of other questions, but I'll leave you to my daughter's book too.
Just 1 minute's thought on this. Bill Clinton, of course, in 1993 swore to Congress that the NAFTA bill would deal effectively with the immigration problem. And of course, simultaneously, he's building a wall in anticipation of what was going to happen. This is something that was not discussed. And of course, ex post, you won't find the media mentioning Clinton's promise, and you won't ever see them tie in the wall building to this alleged reduction of the immigration that was going to follow from the win-win benefits of NAFTA. This is our model does feature suppression, and